I have experienced real third world poverty in my childhood. And the West can no longer dominate planet Earth. The Anglo-Saxon media has a jaundiced view on China, very unwisely.
What will geopolitics look like in 10 years' time?
We cannot just take care of our country, we must take care of the planet Earth as a whole. The story of the 21st century is of all of Asia rising.
During Trump's first term, about 7 to 8 years ago, the tariff war, China was in a position to make concessions.
Yes.
But only 7, 8 years later, this time, China is the only country who can say no to the US trade policies. So what happened? And how do you interpret this dramatic shift?
Well, you're absolutely right. I think in the first Trump administration, China was caught by surprise, caught off guard by some of the measures that President Trump took. And China wasn't quite sure how to respond. But it's very clear. I mean, what I emphasize in my writings is that the structural problem in the US-China contest is that China does have a long-term comprehensive strategy for managing this contest. The United States doesn't have a long-term comprehensive strategy, but this is not my insight. This insight was given to me by Mr. Henry Kissinger, as you know, one of America's greatest strategic thinkers when he was alive. And when I had a one-on-one lunch with him in 2018, before I came to Fudan, he told me that the United States doesn't have a strategy because it is not thinking strategically, thinking long-term about how to manage the return of China. So instead of trying to suppress China, they should try to work out a common set of rules that both sides can live with in such a way that both sides can thrive. That's what I'm advocating. But right now, the United States establishment is somewhat arrogant.
You mean America has not ready for China, but China has prepared years for today's competition with the United States?
Well, certainly, I would say China is definitely preparing better than the United States is. Even before the pressures came from the United States, China had already launched a preemptive strike, for example, against a containment policy by the United States. And that's why many years ago in 2000 or 2001, China proposed a free trade agreement between China and the ASEAN countries. And that free trade agreement has led to an explosion of trade between China and ASEAN from $40 billion in the year 2000 to almost $1 trillion in 2022. But that shows that China understands that to avoid an American containment policy, China's got to improve its ties with all its neighbors.
Yeah,
and
with other countries.
That's what it's been systematically doing for the last 10, 15 years. You know, I gave a lecture in Harvard University, I think way back, also in 2018. And the title of my lecture was, What Happens When China Becomes Number One?
Yes.
And that lecture has had 4 million views. It's amazing.
But, you know, America and China, they are two largest economies in the world. And the world economy is very, very interconnected. So, for the sake of the whole world economy, the two superpowers has to get along to some extent. So what is the best way for the two superpowers to get along?
Well, you're absolutely right when you speak about interdependence, because, in all my writings, going back to my book, The Great Convergence, which came out in 2013, I say that the world has changed fundamentally in the 21st century. And I use a simple boat analogy to explain how the world has changed. Now, in the past, when humanity, 8 billion people, live in 193 separate countries, it was as though they were living in 193 separate boats, right? They're separated from each other. So if one boat catches COVID, another boat won't catch COVID. You're in a different boat, right? But the world has shrunk. And now the 8 billion people of planet Earth no longer live in 193 separate boats. They live in 193 separate cabins on the same boat.
Yeah.
Now, if you're on the same boat, and if there's a disease spreading in other cabins, there's no point locking the door of your cabin. The air comes in, right? So you can't lock yourself out. So therefore, it's best to understand that if you do live on the same boat, you have to work together with others. And at the end of the day, I do believe that our planet Earth is facing some existential challenges like climate change. And to deal with issues like climate change, like pandemics, like global financial crisis, it's important for the great powers not just to compete, but to also cooperate with each other.
Yes.
And that's equally important. And that's the big message I've been trying to convey in my writings on the US-China relationship. It cannot be a completely competitive relationship. They also have to cooperate on many common challenges.
Is it possible? Because, many people on both sides are more and more concerned that the US-China relationship has already become something unmanageable.
I would never see, in diplomacy, you must never give up hope. Things can look terrible, insoluble, but in my experience, I was in diplomacy for 33 years, and things do change. And in the same way, I think we mustn't give up on our efforts, that the 21st century is the Asian century, and the West can no longer dominate planet Earth. In the year 2000, the combined GNP of the European Union was 8 times bigger than China. Now the EU and China are the same size.
Yeah.
By 2050, EU will be half the size of China.
How about the similar comparison between India and the UK?
Because in the year 2000, the British economy was almost 4 times bigger than India. Now, India's economy is bigger than UK. And by 2050, India will be 4 times bigger than UK. And remember, 100 years ago, barely 100 years ago, 100,000 Englishmen, amazingly, could effortlessly rule over 300 million Indians. And now the world has changed completely.
Yes, you said the world has changed completely, and the Western dominance has ended. And let's talk something about the global order we are facing and the global order in the future. Under this U.S. administration, the United States, the biggest thing to the global order, I think, is the United States now is withdrawing the global order, the global system it created and led for over 3 decades. Not because it's weak, not because it has to, because it wants to, it chooses to. And do you think, is it something temporary or is it something permanent?
Well, I would say you do get contradictory signals from the United States. There is no doubt that in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, the United States was, very heavily engaged overseas, involved in all kinds of issues in every corner of the world. And you're right. Right now, there seems to be, relatively speaking, a move to come home, right? To make America great again, to quote President Trump. But even if you look at President Trump's behavior, on the one hand, he says he's not interested in defending Europe. He's not interested in defending Japan or
Asian allies.
Yeah, he wants to make America great again. But yet, if you look at it objectively, President Trump has personally got involved in dealing with issues like Thailand and Cambodia, Gaza, Ukraine, India, Pakistan. So, I mean, it is the American impulse to get engaged with the rest of the world is still very real, So there are contradictory signals from the United States.
Your book, The Asian 21st Century, you believe that the 21st century will be an Asian century. And in today's context, you know that many Asian countries are depending on China economically. But at the same time, they depend on the United States on the security issues. So especially in today's US-China rivalry, how will the Asian countries navigate this kind of rivalry?
That the whole world, Africa, Latin America, are preparing for the Asian century. So, for example, I come from Singapore, which is part of Southeast Asia. And as you know, the ASEAN meetings have been taking place. ASEAN can act as a bridge between the United States and China and help to improve relations between these two countries. For example, by providing opportunities for them to meet and talk to each other at ASEAN meetings. Let me share some good news with you for a change. American policies of unilaterally increasing tariffs on countries around the world have disrupted global trade. No question. But remember that in the last few decades, whenever the United States took the lead on something, and United States would say, I have found a better way to do X. And everyone say, oh, United States is the most advanced country. Let's all follow the United States. Now, this is something amazing that has happened. Ever since President Trump came back to office in January this year and started raising tariffs on the rest of the world, not one country has followed the United States in raising tariffs on the rest of the world. And remember, the United States share of global trade, United States share of the global economy is 25%. But United States share of global trade is only 15%, which means that 85% of global trade is carrying on as normal. And not only that, the other countries are increasing their engagements, opening up their economies. So you take Indonesia, for example, it has just concluded a trade agreement with the European Union. That would not have happened if not for the tariffs that United States has launched. So the reaction of the rest of the world is not to cut off trade, but to increase their trade. And I predict that by the end of this year, you'll find that global trade has not collapsed. In fact, it may even increase slightly by the end of this year. So the global trading system, therefore, will carry on, and other countries around the rest of the world will realize that there's value in being interdependent with each other. So, for example, take two countries that are far apart, like Brazil and China, right? They're so far apart. Now, 20 years ago, it took Brazil 1 year to export $1 billion to China. Now it takes Brazil 72 hours to export $1 billion to China. So, the rest of the world, therefore, is not going to shut off its economies just because the United States has decided to change its policies.
Yes, that's correct. Because, China managed to do very well when it comes to export. The Chinese export to the United States is dropping, but the numbers to the rest of the world is increasing rapidly. But the question is, many people are arguing that, or maybe concerning that the rest of the world will be stuck, will be flooded with Chinese cheap goods. So do you share the same concern, which is the overcapacity problems of Chinese production?
I think China can be sensitive to those concerns. And there are always practical ways and means of managing these situations. So, for example, President Ronald Reagan certainly believed in free trade. But when there was a surge of Japanese exports of cars to the United States, he negotiated with Japan voluntary export restraints. And that helped to solve the problem. And of course, the other way is to avoid too many Japanese imports, was the Americans persuaded the Japanese to manufacture cars in the United States. And I can see the day coming when the United States will say, okay, why don't I allow Chinese electric vehicles to be manufactured in the United States too? Right now, it's difficult because the political environment is very negative. But there are various practical things that can be done. And at the end of the day, China can only grow as an economy if the rest of the world also grows. So in some ways, it is in China's interest to encourage investment in other countries, grow their economies, and then they can also import more, right?
Kishore, you are one of the leading Asian diplomats and welcomed in the Western world, even if many times you say some unwelcoming truth of the United States. And in the Western media, in the Anglo-Saxon media, China was often described as a threat. But also, Kishore, you are a leading thinker of the Global South and talk to the Global South. The question is, tell me, how is the Global South view China?
I'm glad you mentioned the fact that the Anglo-Saxon media has a jaundiced view on China, very unwisely. And as you know, I'm one of the chief critics of the Anglo-Saxon media. The Economist, every few years, they come out with a cover story saying China has peaked, China's about to collapse, the China's economy is stalled, and yet China's just kept growing. Clearly, there are some parts of the Global South that are very happy about China's rise and want to engage China in a much more powerful fashion. And I found that in my travels in Africa, that many African countries want to engage with China. That's also true of some Latin American countries. For example, Brazil wants to engage more with China. But if there's one major country in the Global South that seems to have mixed feelings, and I'll be very honest with you, it's India. The Indians are very troubled by the fact that they have a massive trade deficit with China, and they haven't been able to rectify that. And that's why they haven't joined the regional comprehensive economic partnership. But when I go to India, I tell the Indians as a friend of India, Singapore is a friend of India too. Singapore is a friend of China, Singapore is a friend of India. I tell my Indian friends that it is in India's national interest to join the regional comprehensive economic partnership, because the regional comprehensive economic partnership includes not just the 10 ASEAN countries, it includes China, but it also includes Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand. And it's the world's largest free trade agreement. But the Indians, as of now, are psychologically not ready yet to join the RCEP. But at some point in time, I hope that they will do so, because it will be in India's national interest to do so. But right now, in the Global South, you're right, many countries want to engage China, but India still has some concerns and reservations. But at the same time, as you know, I've recently come out in my memoirs, which I call Living the Asian Century. And in fact, I'm going to Beijing on Monday to launch the Chinese edition of my memoirs, Living the Asian Century. And in my memoirs, I describe what it was like for me growing up as a child in Singapore. I lived in a very poor family in a very poor Singapore. Singapore's per capita income was then the same as Ghana in Africa, $500. And because I came from a very poor family, when I went to school at the age of 6, I was put in a special feeding program because I didn't have enough food at home. And we lived in a house without flush toilet.
Yeah.
My father, he was a gambler, he went to jail. So I have experienced real third world poverty in my childhood. And I emphasize that because until you have experienced real third world poverty, you don't understand the meaning of progress. And you don't understand how wonderful it is that Asia has gone from poverty to now becoming so successful. So I have, in a sense, personally lived through the Asian success story. You know, our per capita income was the same as Ghana in Africa, $500. Today, our per capita income of Singapore is higher than the US.
Final thing, Kishore. You know, what will geopolitics look like in 10 years' time?
Well, I say that we are entering a new 3M world. It's an 3M to describe 3 fundamental changes happening at the same time. The first and most fundamental change is that we are becoming a multi-civilizational world. Now, I emphasize that because for the last 200 years, the West has dominated world history. The West has been on top. Now, other civilizations have reached parity. So that's one major structural strategic adjustment. Several equal civilizations. And then the second M is multipolar world. So it's no longer a case of a unipolar world. The United States is no longer unipolar. But it's also not a bipolar world between the United States and China, because there are other powers with agency and strength, whether it's Russia, India, Brazil, they're all key players still. And the third M is that it's a multilateral world. We are all now 8 billion of us living on the same boat. So whether we like it or not, we have to take care of this boat. And so the more intelligent, the more thoughtful people in the world are also beginning to realize we cannot just take care of our country, we must take care of the planet Earth as a whole.
You mentioned the 3M word. So you believe that in this word you foresee over the next 10 years, China is doing the right thing, and China is a key player in that.
So it is a larger Asian story of which China is playing a leading role, but the story of the 21st century is of all of Asia rising.
Thank you, Kishore. Thank you very much. It's very interesting.
Thank you very much.
你不必成为一个经济学家，但是需要像一个经济学家一样来思考。
其实帮企业就是帮国家。工业革命以来最大的一次迁移。
恐惧比利剑更伤人，信心比黄金更宝贵。
悲观者赢得当下，乐观者赢得未来。
把记录中国经济这件事情共同把它做好。